Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you hold dear. Jonas Hale learned that truth, standing at a church altar in Silver Creek, 1879, forced to marry a woman he'd never wanted to meet. He'd saved her life when her carriage went wild on the mountain pass. He carried her unconscious body into town. Her father, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, said Jonas had ruined her reputation. The punishment was marriage. Jonas stood there angry and trapped. Evelyn Ashford sat beside him, hating every moment, thinking he was beneath her. He thought she was nothing but spoiled pride. Neither wanted this. But something unexpected was about to happen between these two stubborn souls. Would this forced union destroy them both, or could it become something neither saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months before that miserable wedding day, Jonas Hale woke to the sound of silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. In his cabin tucked high in the mountains above Silver Creek, there were no voices demanding anything of him, no expectations pressing down like a heavy hand on his shoulders. Just the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant call of a hawk circling over the valley below. He rose from his bed as the first grey light filtered through the single window. The cabin was simple, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed. One room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table he'd carved from oak, shelves holding supplies, and a bed frame lashed together with rawhide. On the wall hung his father's hunting knife in its worn leather sheath, the blade still sharp after all these years. Jonas reached for it out of habit, running his thumb along the smooth handle before strapping it to his belt. The knife had been his father's, and his grandfather's before that. Marcus Hale had pressed it into Jonas's palm the week before fever took him, when Jonas was barely 19. "A man takes care of himself," his father had whispered, voice rough with sickness. "And when he can, he takes care of others too. That's what this blade is for. Not for killing unless you must, but for living right." Jonas remembered those words every morning. They were part of why he'd chosen this life, far from the complications of towns and the weight of other people's judgments. After his parents died within a year of each other, there'd been nothing holding him to civilization. No siblings, no sweetheart, no trade that couldn't be done in solitude. He'd sold the small farmstead where he'd grown up and headed for the high country, with a mule, basic supplies, and a determination to live on his own terms. That was 8 years ago. 8 years of hunting elk and deer, trapping beaver and fox, trading pelts in town twice a year for coffee, flour, and ammunition. 8 years of mending his own clothes, cooking his own meals, and speaking to no one for weeks at a time. Some men would have gone mad from the loneliness. Jonas found it suited him just fine. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, breathing deep. September in the mountains meant the aspens were turning gold, and the first hint of winter rode on the northern wind. He'd need to finish smoking the venison, check his trap lines, and reinforce the cabin's chinking before the heavy snows came. Work enough to fill his days with purpose. Jonas walked to the creek that ran 50 yards from his door, knelt and splashed cold water on his face. His reflection wavered in the current. A man of 32 with a thick beard, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes that had forgotten how to soften when they looked at other people. He'd grown comfortable with that face, with the solitude it represented. Down in the valley, Silver Creek was waking up to a very different kind of morning. Evelyn Ashford stood in front of her mirror, pins clenched between her teeth as she arranged her dark hair into an elaborate style her mother would have approved of. Would have. The thought still cut, even though Mama had been gone for 5 years now. Evelyn forced the grief aside with practiced efficiency. There was no time for sadness, not when Father expected her downstairs in 20 minutes, perfectly dressed and perfectly composed, ready to smile at whatever business associates he'd invited for breakfast. The Ashford Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, a small empire built by her grandfather and expanded by her father Nathaniel. The main house reflected that wealth, 2 stories of imported wood and stone, with furnishings shipped from back east and carpets from Europe. Evelyn's bedroom alone was larger than most families' entire homes. Velvet curtains, a 4-poster bed, a wardrobe filled with dresses she wore to maintain appearances at church socials and dinner parties. She adjusted the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's favorite piece. Evelyn Ashford had been gentle where Nathaniel was hard, warm where he was cold. She died when pneumonia swept through the valley, and something in Nathaniel had died with her. He'd poured himself into the ranch after that, into acquiring more land, more cattle, more influence. And he'd expected Evelyn to become the perfect ornament for his empire, polished, obedient, marriageable to whoever would best serve his interests. At 26, Evelyn knew the town whispered about her. Too old to still be unmarried, too proud to accept the proposal she'd received, too sharp-tongued to be properly feminine. Let them whisper. She'd turned down 3 men whose only virtues were their bank accounts and pedigrees. She might be her father's daughter, but she wasn't his property to auction off. Still, the pressure weighed on her. Every social gathering, every pointed comment from Nathaniel about her future, every pitying look from married women who'd settled for security over anything resembling love. Evelyn had learned to armor herself with perfect posture and cutting wit, to hide any vulnerability beneath layers of silk and propriety. She descended the stairs to find her father in the dining room with 2 men she didn't recognize. Nathaniel Ashford was an imposing figure, even in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that assessed everything as either useful or disposable. He barely glanced at her as she entered. "Evelyn, this is Mr. Harrison from the Territorial Land Office and his associate Mr. Perth. Gentlemen, my daughter." She nodded politely, took her seat, and let the conversation wash over her. Business talk. Property lines and water rights and political maneuvering. The same discussions that filled this house every day, as if money and land were the only things worth caring about. Her thoughts drifted to her mother's garden, now overgrown and neglected since there was no one to tend it. Catherine had loved growing things, had spent hours with her hands in the soil, coaxing roses and lilies to bloom in the harsh valley climate. Evelyn missed watching her there, missed the gentleness her mother had brought to this hard place. "Evelyn," her father's sharp tone snapped her attention back. "Yes, I asked if you planned to attend the church social on Saturday. I hadn't decided." "You'll attend. The Kellers will be there, and their son James has just returned from Denver." The implication hung heavy in the air. Another potential suitor for Nathaniel to evaluate. Evelyn met her father's gaze levelly. "I'll consider it." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more in front of his guests. The message was clear enough. Her time for independence was running out. Soon Nathaniel would make the choice for her, and she'd be expected to comply for the sake of the family name and fortune. She excused herself as soon as breakfast ended, stepping out onto the wide porch that wrapped around the house. The September sun was climbing higher, warming the valley. From here, she could see the ranch hands working the horse corrals, smell the dust and sage, hear the distant lowing of cattle. The Ashford ranch was beautiful in its way, prosperous and orderly, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was suffocating under the weight of it all. She didn't know that in 3 weeks. Her father would insist she take the carriage into town for a dress fitting. She didn't know the harness would snap on the mountain road, sending the horses into a panicked run. She didn't know a solitary mountain man named Jonas Hale would risk his life to stop those horses and pull her from the wreckage. And she certainly didn't know that act of heroism would chain them both to a future neither wanted. For now, she stood on her father's porch in her expensive dress with her mother's brooch at her throat, watching the valley and wondering if this was all her life would ever be. Up in the mountains, Jonas checked his trap lines and thought about nothing more complicated than whether the coming winter would be harsh or mild. 2 people living separate lives, unaware that fate was about to force them together in the most binding way possible. unaware that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the best thing you never knew you needed. But that understanding was still months away, past anger and resentment, past pride and pain. In a future neither could imagine standing in that September sunlight. The wedding night was a silent journey into exile. Jonas guided his horse up the narrow mountain trail, with Evelyn perched side saddle behind him, her white dress already stained with dust and pine sap. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the church, and he hadn't tried to make conversation. What was there to say? They were strangers, bound by law and circumstance, heading toward a life neither had chosen. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. Jonas felt the rigid tension in Evelyn's body, where she was forced to hold onto his waist for balance. Even that small contact felt like an accusation. He'd saved her life, and this was his reward. Shackled to a woman who despised everything about him. 3 weeks had passed since the accident. 3 weeks since he'd been checking his trap lines and heard the thunder of panicked horses on the road below. He'd reached the runaway carriage just as it careened toward a cliff edge, managing to grab the lead horse's bridle and haul the team to a stop through sheer strength and desperation. The woman inside had been unconscious, a gash on her forehead bleeding freely. He'd lifted her out, carried her the 2 miles into town to the doctor's office. He'd expected gratitude, maybe a reward he'd politely refuse. Instead, he'd gotten Nathaniel Ashford's cold fury and an ultimatum delivered in the sheriff's office: marry Evelyn or face charges of impropriety that would see Jonas driven from the territory. His land claims revoked. Possibly worse. "You carried my daughter through town in her torn dress," Nathaniel had said, voice like granite. "You were alone with her, unchaperoned, for hours. Her reputation is compromised. You'll marry her and restore her honor, or I'll see you destroyed," Jonas had argued. He'd pointed out the insanity of forcing a marriage over a rescue. But Nathaniel Ashford owned the town, owned the sheriff, owned everything that mattered. And Jonas, a solitary mountain man with no family and no influence, owned nothing but a cabin and his pride. The pride hadn't been enough to save him. Now they climbed higher into the mountains, away from civilization, toward the cabin that would be their prison. Jonas felt the weight of the simple gold ring on his finger, felt the matching one on Evelyn's hand where it gripped his coat, symbols of a union that was nothing but a legal fiction. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was touching the western peaks. Jonas dismounted and turned to help Evelyn down. She refused his offered hand, sliding off the horse herself and nearly stumbling in her impractical wedding dress and shoes. She caught herself against the horse's flank and straightened, looking at the cabin with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. Horror. That's what it was. Pure horror. "This is where you live?" Her voice was quiet but sharp. "This is where we live now," Jonas said, gathering their few belongings from the saddlebags. The wedding had been hastily arranged. Evelyn had been allowed to pack only a single trunk of her things. She walked slowly toward the cabin, her white dress dragging through the dirt. Jonas watched her take in the rough log construction, the single room visible through the open door, the complete absence of anything resembling luxury or comfort. When she turned back to him, her face was pale beneath the fading bruise on her forehead from the accident. "There's no separate bedroom. It's one room. I can't possibly—" She stopped, clearly struggling for words that wouldn't sound too aristocratic. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" "I'll take the floor." "You can have the bed." Jonas moved past her, carrying the trunk inside. He set it down near the far wall and began clearing space. Evelyn followed him in, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. The cabin looked smaller with her in it, more primitive. He saw it through her eyes. The rough furniture, the stone fireplace with ash still in it from this morning's fire, the shelves of supplies, the pelts hanging to cure. No wallpaper, no carpets, no decoration beyond function. A place built for survival, not comfort. "There's no kitchen." Her voice had climbed higher. "The fireplace serves for cooking. No washroom. Creaks down the slope. There's a basin for washing inside." She turned in a slow circle, and Jonas saw her hands trembling. The carefully maintained composure was cracking. "This is impossible. I can't live like this. I won't. You don't have a choice." The words came out harder than he'd intended. "Neither of us do. Your father did this to us." Jonas faced her fully, anger rising in his chest. "I saved your life, and he repaid me by destroying mine. You think I want you here? You think I want a wife who looks at me like I'm something scraped off her shoe?" Evelyn's face flushed. "I never asked you to save me. Would you rather I'd let you die?" "I'd rather you'd left me at the doctor's office and gone back to your mountain. Then none of this would have happened." The words hung between them, cruel and honest. Jonas felt something cold settle in his chest. "Well, it did happen, and now we're stuck with each other. So you'll sleep in that bed, I'll sleep on the floor, and we'll stay out of each other's way as much as possible in a one-room cabin." He turned away, busying himself with building up the fire. Behind him, he heard Evelyn's breathing turn ragged, heard her fight for control. When he glanced back, she was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, still wearing her wedding dress, looking lost and terrified in a way that made him feel guilty despite his anger. She was right to be terrified. She'd been raised in luxury, waited on by servants, sheltered from any real hardship. This cabin would be hell for her. He knew that. But knowing it didn't change their situation. "There's a nightdress in your trunk, I imagine," Jonas said more quietly. "You can change behind the blanket there. I'll step outside." He did, giving her privacy even though it was probably a courtesy she didn't expect from a rough mountain man. He stood on the small porch he'd built, watching the last light fade from the sky, and wondered how his life had turned so completely upside down in the space of 3 weeks. Inside, he heard Evelyn moving around, heard the trunk open and close, heard the rustle of fabric. When enough time had passed, he knocked on the doorframe. "Decent?" "Yes." Her voice was thick, as if she'd been crying silently. He entered to find her sitting on the edge of the bed in a white nightdress, her wedding gown folded carefully on the trunk. Her dark hair was unpinned and fell around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable. The cameo brooch she'd worn was clutched in her hand. "That belonged to your mother?" Jonas asked, nodding toward it. Evelyn looked up, surprised he'd noticed. "Yes, my father's knife is the only thing I have of his. It's not much, but it matters." She studied him for a long moment, and some of the hostility eased from her expression. Not much, but enough that he could see the person beneath the anger. "I'm sorry about your parents. I'm sorry about your mother." He meant it. "And I'm sorry about all of this." Evelyn nodded slowly. "So am I." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was the first honest thing they'd shared since standing at that altar. Jonas fetched blankets from the shelf and made himself a pallet on the floor near the fireplace. Evelyn climbed into the bed without another word, turning her face to the wall. The cabin fell silent, except for the pop and crackle of the fire. Jonas lay on the hard floor and stared at the ceiling beams he'd hewn himself, trying not to think about the woman in his bed who wished she were anywhere else. Trying not to think about the freedom he'd lost, the solitude he'd cherished, the life he'd built that was now ashes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Evelyn would have to learn to survive here, and he'd have to teach her whether he wanted to or not. They'd have to find some way to coexist in this small space without destroying each other. But tonight, they lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the cabin. Two people bound by law but separated by anger, pride, and the simple fact that neither had chosen this fate. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming autumn. The first hard freeze would come soon. Winter in the high country was unforgiving, and Evelyn Ashford had no idea what she was in for. Neither did Jonas, though for entirely different reasons. He thought the hardest part was behind them, that they'd simply endure this forced marriage in cold civility until one of them died or circumstances changed. He had no idea that the hardest part was just beginning. That proximity would breed something more dangerous than hatred, that somewhere in the long winter ahead, between anger and resentment, something entirely unexpected would take root. But that first night, all they knew was the silence between them and the impossibility of what they'd been forced to become. Husband and wife, in name only, strangers sharing a space too small for secrets, beginning a journey neither wanted toward a destination, neither could imagine. 6 weeks after the wedding, Evelyn woke to find she'd slept through Jonas's morning routine. The fire was built, the coffee was ready, and sunlight streamed through the window. She'd become so accustomed to the rhythms of cabin life that she no longer startled awake at every sound. Her hands had healed and calloused. Her back no longer ached from bending over the creek to wash clothes. She could split kindling now, though Jonas still handled the larger logs. She'd adapted. Not perfectly, but genuinely. The realization should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like accomplishment. Jonas came in from checking the snares with 2 rabbits and a grouse. He nodded to her, an acknowledgement that had become their morning greeting. Words weren't always necessary anymore. They'd developed a language of gestures and glances that made communication easier in the small space. "Good haul," Evelyn said, moving to help him prepare the game. He showed her how to properly dress the rabbits, patient when she hesitated, firm when she needed to be. She'd learned that Jonas taught through demonstration rather than explanation, and she'd become better at watching, at mimicking his efficient movements. Her squeamishness about blood and death had faded from necessity. This was how they survived. This was the price of eating. They worked together preparing the meat for smoking, and Evelyn realized they'd fallen into a partnership without deciding to. Small efficiencies had emerged. She'd hand him the salt before he asked. He'd move the pot before she reached for it. They navigated around each other in the cramped cabin, like dancers who'd learned each other's steps. "We need to go to town for supplies before the heavy snows hit," Jonas said. "Hanging the meat in the smokehouse. Flour, beans, ammunition. Probably should pick up warmer clothes for you, too. What you brought won't be enough for winter up here. Town meant facing people." Evelyn hadn't been back to Silver Creek since the wedding. She wasn't sure she wanted to face the stares, the whispers, the pity or judgment she'd see in familiar faces. But Jonas was right about the supplies. When? Tomorrow, if the weather holds. They rode down the mountain the next morning, Evelyn more comfortable on horseback than she'd been 6 weeks ago. Jonas had been teaching her to ride properly, and she'd discovered she enjoyed it. The freedom of movement, the connection with the animal, the way the world opened up from horseback. Another unexpected gift from this life she'd been forced into. Silver Creek bustled with activity as they arrived. Ranchers preparing for winter, merchants moving stock before the roads became impassable. Evelyn felt the attention shift to them immediately. Conversations paused, heads turned. She saw Mrs. Henderson from the church whisper to her daughter. Saw Mr. Carson from the bank raise his eyebrows in surprise. Jonas seemed oblivious to it all, or maybe he'd just learned to ignore it long ago. He tied the horses and headed for the general store. Evelyn followed, keeping her head high. Let them stare. She'd done nothing to be ashamed of. Inside, Mr. Patterson behind the counter greeted Jonas warmly. "Haven't seen you in a spell. Heard you got married. Congratulations." "Thanks." Jonas began listing supplies, and Patterson gathered them efficiently. "Mrs. Hale," Patterson said, acknowledging Evelyn with genuine warmth. "Good to see you looking well." "Mountain life seems to agree with you." Evelyn blinked in surprise. She'd expected judgment, not kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson." While Jonas paid, a man Evelyn didn't recognize made a comment loud enough to carry. Nathaniel Ashford's daughter married to a mountain hermit. How the mighty have fallen. The store went quiet. Evelyn felt her face heat, but before she could respond, Jonas turned around. "Evelyn fell from nothing," he said quietly, dangerously. She chose to stand beside her husband. "That's rising, not falling. If you've got a problem with that, you can say it to me directly, instead of muttering like a coward." The man backed down, mumbling an apology. Patterson cleared his throat. "Jonas is right. Takes courage to build a new life. Mrs. Hale's got more spine than most." The unexpected defense made Evelyn's throat tight. Jonas gathered their supplies and guided her outside with a hand on her elbow. "Not possessive, just protective. Supportive. You didn't have to defend me," she said once they were alone by the horses. "Yes, I did. You're my wife. Maybe not in the way we'd have chosen, but it's still true. Nobody disrespects you while I'm standing there." Something warm bloomed in Evelyn's chest. Not love, not yet, but gratitude, recognition, the sense that maybe they were becoming a team. even if they hadn't meant to. On the ride back, Jonas was unusually talkative, pointing out landmarks, sharing stories about the valley. He showed her where he'd first seen a grizzly, where the best fishing was, where his father had taught him to track. Evelyn listened, asking questions, learning the geography of his world. Near a meadow halfway up the mountain, Jonas stopped and dismounted. "There's something here I thought you might like." He led her to a small clearing where late-season wildflowers still bloomed despite the approaching winter. Hardy mountain flowers in deep purple and gold, clinging to the last warm days. Jonas knelt and carefully picked one, a purple bloom with delicate petals. He held it out to her awkwardly. "These grow high up where most flowers can't survive. They're tough." "Reminded me of you." Evelyn took the flower, stunned by the gesture, by the comparison. Jonas thought she was tough, that she'd survived and adapted, that she was like these resilient mountain flowers, beautiful despite harsh conditions. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll press it." "Keep it. It's just a flower." "No, it's more than that." She met his eyes and saw him understand. It was acknowledgement, respect, the first truly kind thing he'd given her since this marriage began. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they reached the cabin, Evelyn carefully pressed the wildflower between the pages of the one book she'd brought from her old life, her mother's Bible. She closed it gently, preserving the gift. That night they worked together preparing dinner, and for the first time, Evelyn laughed at something Jonas said, a dry observation about one of the townspeople they'd seen. Not a loud laugh, just a genuine expression of amusement. Jonas looked startled, then pleased, as if he'd discovered something unexpected. "You should laugh more," he said. "I haven't had much to laugh about. Neither have I. Maybe we should change that." It was a small moment, barely worth noting in the grand scheme of their forced union. But Evelyn felt it settle in her chest, like a seed finding soil. The possibility that this marriage, this life, might become more than survival, might become something approaching happiness. She looked at Jonas across the fire. This rough man who'd defended her in town, who'd given her a flower, who was trying in his awkward way to make space for joy. She saw the man beneath the hardness, the person his mother's letters had revealed. The man who cared even when he pretended not to, and she realized with a mixture of fear and wonder that her feelings toward him were shifting. That resentment was giving way to something warmer, more dangerous, something that felt like the beginning of genuine affection. Jonas met her gaze, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that things were changing, whether they'd planned for it or not. That proximity and shared struggle were creating something neither had expected. Neither spoke of it. Not yet, but both felt it, hanging in the air like the smoke from the fire. Impossible to ignore. The mountain lion came just before dawn. 3 days later, Evelyn woke to a sound that raised every primitive instinct in her body, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. She sat up in the darkness, heart hammering, and saw Jonas already on his feet, rifle in hand, moving toward the door with deadly quiet. "Stay inside," he whispered. "No matter what you hear," the horse was screaming. Evelyn heard the terror in that sound, heard the crashing of the corral fence. Jonas slipped outside, and she was left in the dark cabin, listening to sounds that belonged in nightmares. The lion's growl, Jonas's shout, the sharp crack of the rifle. Then silence. Evelyn waited, counting her own heartbeats, every second stretching into eternity. When Jonas finally came back inside, there was blood on his shirt, and his hands were shaking. "It's dead." "Horse is spooked but unhurt." He set the rifle down carefully and stood there, the adrenaline still coursing through him. Evelyn moved without thinking, crossing to him, reaching up to check if the blood was his. "Are you hurt?" "No, it's the lion's. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. She could see the tremor in his hands, the way his breathing hadn't quite steadied. He'd faced death out there in the darkness, and it had left its mark. "Sit down." She guided him to the chair, poured whiskey from the bottle he kept for emergencies. "Drink." He did, and gradually the shaking eased. Evelyn sat across from him, and they waited for dawn together. Neither speaking, both processing how close disaster had come. When light finally broke, they went out to examine the dead cat. It was massive, easily 200 pounds, with muscles that spoke of strength and hunger. Jonas had shot it cleanly through the heart, a remarkable feat in the darkness. "If you hadn't woken up," Evelyn said quietly, "but I did." Jonas crouched beside the animal, studying it with the respect one predator gives another. It was old, probably desperate. Old cats get pushed out of good territory, forced to take risks they normally wouldn't, like attacking near a cabin. Exactly. He stood, looking at her seriously. "This is the mountain, Evelyn. It's beautiful, but it's not tame. Things like this happen. You need to know that. I'm learning." She met his eyes. "You could have died protecting that horse. That horse is how we survive winter. How we get to town if there's an emergency. And besides..." He paused, then continued more quietly, "I'd have done it regardless. It's my responsibility to protect what's mine." "What's mine?" The words hung between them. He meant the cabin, the horse, the life he'd built. But Evelyn heard something else in it too, an inclusion that made her chest tighten. She was part of what he protected now, whether either of them had wanted that or not. Later, after they'd dragged the lion's body away and secured the shaken horse, they sat by the fire with coffee. The adrenaline had faded, leaving them both exhausted but awake, too keyed up to sleep despite the early hour. "I never told you about the day my father died," Jonas said suddenly. "How it happened." Evelyn waited, sensing he needed to tell this story his own way, in his own time. He'd been sick for a week. Fever cough that wouldn't quit. My mother and I took turns sitting with him. On the last day, he called me in alone. He couldn't talk much by then, but he managed to give me this. Jonas pulled the pocket watch from his vest, the one Evelyn had seen him check countless times. It was his father's and his father's before that. He said it represented time, and time was the one thing we couldn't get back once it was gone. He opened the watch. The hands had stopped at 3:47. That's when he died. I was holding his hand when it happened, and I heard the watch stop at the same moment, like his time had literally run out. I've never wound it again. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. You've been carrying that stop time with you for 8 years. I couldn't let it go. Couldn't move forward. The grief just... He stopped, jaw working. It froze me. I came up here to escape it, but I brought it with me. This watch around my neck like a stone. Jonas. Evelyn reached across and gently touched his hand. Your father wouldn't want you frozen. Your mother's letters made that clear. They wanted you to live, not just survive. I know. I've known for a long time. But knowing and doing are different things. He looked at the watch, then at her. Until recently I thought I was fine alone. That I didn't need anyone. That solitude was enough. And now I'm not sure. His eyes met hers with an honesty that made her breath catch. You've been here 2 months, and the cabin doesn't feel as empty anymore. I wake up and hear you moving around, and it doesn't bother me like I thought it would. Sometimes I catch myself looking forward to sharing a meal, to hearing what you think about something. It scares me. Why does it scare you? Because caring about someone means you can lose them. And I've lost everyone I cared about. I don't know if I can survive that again. Evelyn understood then what she'd been feeling, what had been building between them. It wasn't just attraction or convenience. It was connection, real and deepening, the kind that came from truly seeing another person, from sharing space and struggle and small victories. I'm scared too, she admitted. I never expected to feel anything for you except resentment. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it is happening. Yes. They sat in the firelight, hands touching across the small table, neither moving away. The morning's danger had stripped away pretense, had forced honesty neither was quite ready for but couldn't avoid. Jonas turned his hand over, palm up, and Evelyn laced her fingers through his. His hand was rough, calloused, enormous compared to hers. But it was warm and steady, and holding it felt right in a way that terrified her. I don't know how to do this, Jonas said quietly. I don't know how to let someone in. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together. Together. He said the word like he was testing it, seeing how it felt. I haven't been part of a together in a long time. Neither have I, not really. My father and I existed in the same house, but we were never together. Not after my mother died? Jonas squeezed her hand gently. Maybe that's why we're both so bad at this. We've forgotten how, then we'll remember. Or learn new ways. They stayed like that as the sun rose higher, warming the cabin, burning off the last shadows of the night's danger. Two people slowly, carefully opening doors they'd thought were permanently locked. Risking the hurt that comes with caring, despite every instinct that screamed at them to protect themselves. The pocket watch sat on the table between them, its hands frozen at 3:47, marking a death that had shaped Jonas's life. But beside it, their joined hands marked something else. The possibility of life continuing, of time moving forward again, of healing that came not from forgetting the past, but from choosing to face the future anyway. Outside, the mountain was waking up to another day. Inside, Jonas and Evelyn were waking up to something far more dangerous and precious. The realization that their forced marriage might become a chosen one after all. The messenger arrived on a November morning when the first serious snow was threatening. A young ranch hand from the Ashford spread, riding hard, his horse lathered despite the cold. Jonas met him outside while Evelyn was baking bread, and she heard the urgency in their voices through the open door. "Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale," the boy said, breathless. "Mr. Ashford sent me. Says it's urgent. Says Mrs. Hale needs to come home right away." Evelyn emerged from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands. "What's happened? Is my father hurt?" "No, ma'am, but there's trouble. Bad trouble. He wouldn't tell me the details, just said to fetch you both immediately." Jonas looked at Evelyn, a question in his eyes. She nodded. Whatever had happened, they'd face it together. That was new, that instinct to unite against outside threats. 2 months ago, they'd have approached this separately, each protecting their own interests. Now they moved as a unit. They rode down to the valley in tense silence, arriving at the Ashford ranch as the sun reached its zenith. The place looked the same, impressive, prosperous, commanding. But something felt wrong. Too quiet. Several ranch hands stood in clusters, talking in low voices that stopped when Jonas and Evelyn appeared. Nathaniel met them at the door. He looked 10 years older than when Evelyn had last seen him at the wedding. His face was grey, his eyes hollowed by what looked like sleepless nights. "Thank God you came. What's wrong?" Evelyn demanded. "Inside." "Not here." He glanced at the watching ranch hands nervously. In his study, with the door closed, Nathaniel poured himself whiskey with shaking hands. Jonas stood by the door, while Evelyn took a chair, her spine straight, braced for whatever was coming. "There's a man," Nathaniel began. "Victor Caney. He arrived 3 days ago with lawyers and documents. He's claiming I owe him a substantial debt. $200,000. Evelyn's breath caught. That was an enormous sum, enough to bankrupt even the Ashford ranch. "How could you possibly owe that much?" "I don't, at least I shouldn't." Nathaniel set down his glass with a crack. 10 years ago, when I was expanding the ranch, I needed capital. Caney was a land speculator new to the territory. He offered me favorable terms on a loan. I took it. I paid it back with interest 5 years ago. I have records. Then what's the problem?" Jonas asked. "He claims the loan was for twice what I borrowed. His documents show different numbers than mine, and he's got judges who'll back him up. Men I thought were friends, men I've done business with for decades." Nathaniel's voice cracked. "They're all in his pocket." "There has to be something you can do," Evelyn said. "Lawyers, appeals, I've tried. Caney's been busy. He's bought loyalty throughout the territory. And there's more." Nathaniel pulled a folder from his desk drawer, opened it with trembling hands. "He had investigators look into how I acquired my land originally. They found things I thought were buried." He spread documents across the desk. Jonas and Evelyn leaned in to read. What they saw made Evelyn's stomach turn cold. Forged land deeds, claims filed under false names, testimony bought to displace rightful owners, properties seized through legal manipulation and outright fraud. The Ashford Empire hadn't been built through hard work and fair dealing. It had been built on lies, theft, and cruelty. "Father," Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "What did you do?" "What I had to do to survive. To build something lasting for you, for our family." Nathaniel couldn't meet her eyes. The valley was chaos when I started. Everyone was grabbing what they could. I just did it better than most. Jonas was reading through the documents, his face hard. Some of these properties belonged to people I knew. The Hendersons, old Thomas's family. You took their water rights through fraud. It was business. It was theft. Jonas's voice was cold with rage. You ruined people. Families lost everything because of your lies. I gave them work. They had jobs on my ranch after you stole what was rightfully theirs. Jonas threw the papers down. You're no better than Caney. Worse, maybe, because you wrapped your theft in respectability. Evelyn felt like the floor had dropped away beneath her. Everything she'd known about her family, about her father's legacy, was a lie. The wealth she'd grown up with had been stolen from honest people. Her mother's beautiful house had been built on fraud. Her entire life had been constructed on a foundation of cruelty. Does Caney know about this? She asked, her voice hollow. He knows. He's threatening to expose everything if I don't sign over the ranch to him. All of it. Every acre, every building, every head of cattle. Nathaniel finally looked at her, and she saw genuine fear in his eyes. And he wants something else. What? You. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. He saw you at the church social last year before all this. He made comments then about how suitable you'd be. Now he's saying if I cooperate, if I sign everything over, and you leave that mountain and come with him, he'll keep the fraud quiet. I won't face criminal charges. The family name stays intact. The room went dead silent. Evelyn heard her own heartbeat, felt Jonas go rigid beside her. Victor Caney didn't just want the ranch. He wanted her. This was about power, control, and the sick desire to possess what he'd decided he wanted. No. Jonas's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Absolutely not. You don't have a say in this, Hale. This is family business. She's my wife. That makes it my business. Jonas moved closer to Evelyn, positioning himself between her and Nathaniel. You're not trading her like property to save your stolen empire. My stolen empire? Nathaniel's voice rose. You think you're so much better? You're nobody. You live in a shack in the mountains. You have nothing to offer her. I offer her honesty. Something you've never given. Jonas looked at Evelyn. We're leaving. This isn't our problem. But Evelyn couldn't move. She was staring at the documents, at the evidence of her father's crimes, thinking about all the people who'd been hurt. Old Thomas's family, the Hendersons who'd always been kind to her. Dozens of others whose names she didn't know but who'd lost everything to Nathaniel's greed. The ranch hands, she said quietly. If Caney takes over, what happens to them? He'll bring his own people. They'll be out of work. Probably lose their homes too, since most live on ranch property. Nathaniel slumped in his chair. Evelyn, I know I've done terrible things. I know I failed you, failed your mother's memory. But those people didn't do anything wrong. They don't deserve to suffer because of my mistakes. They'll suffer because of your crimes, Jonas corrected. Don't try to paint yourself as noble now. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of the ranch hands stuck his head in. Mr. Ashford, Mr. Kane is here. Says he wants an answer by sundown. Tell him to wait. Nathaniel's voice was hollow. After the hand left, Evelyn stood and walked to the window. She could see a group of men by the corral. One of them, a tall man in expensive clothes, had to be Kane. Even from a distance there was something predatory about him. Something that made her skin crawl. He'll take the ranch anyway, she said, thinking out loud. Even if I went with him, he'd take it. That's what men like him do. They take and take until there's nothing left. Evelyn, her father started, be quiet. She turned to face both men. Jonas, can you go outside for a moment? I need to speak with my father alone. Jonas hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave her. But he nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind him. Evelyn faced her father across the desk, covered in evidence of his crimes. I have spent my entire life trying to live up to standards you set. Trying to be perfect enough, polished enough, valuable enough to matter to you. And now I find out that everything you built, everything you taught me to value, was rotten from the start. Evelyn, I'm sorry. No! You don't get to be sorry yet. You get to listen. Her voice was steel. I am not going with Caney. I'm not leaving Jonas. Not for you, not for the ranch, not for anyone. What happens to this place is a consequence of choices you made long before I was born. But the workers deserve better than both you and Caney. Evelyn picked up the documents. These prove his own documents are partially forged too, don't they? He's using the same tricks you did. Nathaniel nodded slowly. I noticed that. But it won't matter if the judges are paid off. Then we go over their heads. To the territorial marshal. To federal authorities if necessary. Evelyn's mind was racing. And we make things right. The people you stole from, we compensate them. We can't fix the past, but we can try to balance the scales. That would cost everything. You're losing everything anyway. At least this way you might keep your soul. Evelyn moved toward the door, then stopped. I love Jonas. I didn't expect to, didn't want to. But he's the first honest man I've ever known. And I choose him over all of this, over everything. Remember that when you're deciding what kind of man you want to be in whatever time you have left. She left him sitting in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, and went to find her husband. Jonas was waiting on the porch, his face dark with anger and worry. When he saw her, some of the tension eased. Are you all right? No, but I will be. She took his hand. We need to fight Caney, not for my father, but for the people who'll lose everything if that man takes over. Evelyn, this isn't your battle. Yes, it is. My father's crimes don't disappear just because I didn't commit them. I'm part of this whether I want to be or not. And those ranch workers, those families, they don't deserve to suffer. She squeezed his hand. Help me, please. Jonas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war in his eyes, the desire to protect her fighting with the knowledge that she was right. Finally he nodded. Together then. But if Caney comes near you, he's a dead man. Together. Evelyn stood on her toes and kissed him, quick and fierce, claiming him in front of anyone who might be watching. Let's go meet this Victor Kane. They descended the porch steps, hand in hand, two people bound by more than forced marriage now. Bound by choice, by growing love, by the determination to face whatever came next as partners. Victor Caney was everything Jonas despised in a man. Polished boots, expensive suit, gold watch chain glinting in the afternoon sun. He smiled like a predator as Jonas and Evelyn approached, his eyes moving over Evelyn with an ownership that made Jonas's fists clench. Mrs. Hale, Caney said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Or should I say Miss Ashford? I understand your marriage is something of a formality. You understand wrong. Jonas stepped slightly in front of Evelyn. She's my wife in every way that matters, and you do well to remember that. Caney's smile didn't waver. Of course. My apologies. I meant no disrespect to your arrangement. The word arrangement dripped with dismissal. I'm here to finalize terms with Nathaniel. I trust he's told you the situation. We know about your claims, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite Jonas feeling the tension in her. We also know they're built on documents as fraudulent as any my father created. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth, and we're prepared to prove it. Evelyn held Kane's gaze without flinching. You're not taking this ranch, Mr. Kane. Not through extortion, not through threats, and certainly not through me. Something cold flashed through Kane's eyes. The pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cruelty beneath. You think you have a choice in this? Your father built his empire on lies. I have evidence that will destroy him, will see him in prison. The Ashford name will be worth less than dirt. Unless, of course, certain arrangements are made. No arrangements will be made. Jonas moved closer, and he was gratified to see Caney take an involuntary step back. You've got until sundown to get off this property. After that, I'll remove you myself. You're just a mountain hermit. You have no authority here. I have the authority of a man protecting his family. That's all I need. Caney looked between them, reassessing. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't united resistance. He'd anticipated breaking Nathaniel, claiming his daughter and his property. Instead, he'd found a couple who stood together, who wouldn't be intimidated. This isn't over, Caney said quietly. I'll have what I came for, one way or another. Then you'll have a fight. Evelyn's voice was calm but absolute. And you'll lose. Caney replaced his hat and walked away, his hired men following. Jonas watched until they rode out of sight, then turned to Evelyn. "We need a plan. Caney won't give up easily. I know. Let's go back to the cabin. We need privacy to think this through." The ride back up the mountain was tense. Jonas's mind raced through possibilities, strategies, dangers. Caney was powerful, connected, ruthless. They were two people with limited resources. But they had something Caney didn't understand. They had each other, and they had a community Nathaniel had neglected but hadn't entirely destroyed. At the cabin they worked late into the night. Evelyn went through the documents she'd taken from her father's study, looking for weaknesses in Caney's claims. Jonas made notes of people who might help. Old Thomas and the other mountain families, ranch hands who'd be loyal to fairness if not to Nathaniel, merchants in town who'd been hurt by Caney's business practices. "Here," Evelyn said suddenly, pointing to a document. "This deed shows Caney claiming he loaned my father $200,000. But look at the date. It's supposedly from 10 years ago, but the paper is too new. The ink hasn't faded the way it should." Jonas examined it closely. She was right. "Can you prove it?" "I think so. My father keeps meticulous records, always has. If I can find the original loan documents, we can show the forgery." She looked up at him, exhaustion and determination mixing in her expression. "We need to go through his entire study, tonight while he's asleep, before Caney can destroy evidence. That's dangerous. Caney's men could still be around, I know, but it's necessary." They rode back down in the darkness, moving quietly through the sleeping ranch. Evelyn knew which boards creaked, which windows stayed unlocked. They slipped into Nathaniel's study like thieves, which in a way they were, stealing back truth from a house built on lies. For 3 hours they searched, and gradually they built their case. Original documents that proved Caney's forgeries. Records showing the judges he'd bribed had taken money from him in recent weeks. Evidence that he'd used the same tactics in other territories, leaving ruined families in his wake. "This is enough," Jonas said finally. "We can take this to the territorial marshal. If he's honest, he'll have to investigate." "Marshal Williams is honest. My father complained about him often enough because he couldn't be bought." Evelyn gathered the documents carefully. "But we need more than just evidence of Caney's crimes. We need to address my father's too." "Evelyn, no, Jonas. We can't let him escape consequences. The people he hurt deserve justice." She pulled out another folder. "These show everyone my father defrauded. We contact them, offer restitution, use what's left of the ranch to make things right." Jonas looked at her with something approaching awe. "That'll leave your father with almost nothing." "Good. Maybe then he'll understand what he took from others." Her voice was firm but not cruel. "And maybe he'll have a chance to become better than he's been." They left as quietly as they'd come, taking the evidence with them. Back at the cabin, as dawn approached, they finally allowed themselves to rest. But Jonas couldn't sleep. He watched Evelyn in the firelight, this woman who'd been forced into his life and had somehow become its center. "I love you," he said quietly. Not sure if she was awake. She turned to face him, and her eyes were open, shining with tears and something that might have been joy. "Say it again. I love you, Evelyn." "I didn't want to. Fought against it. But you're brave and honest and stronger than I ever gave you credit for. You're everything I didn't know I needed." She left the bed and came to where he lay on his pallet by the fire. She knelt beside him and cupped his face in her hands. "I love you too. You're the first person who ever saw me as someone capable of more than just being decorative. You expected me to be strong, and that made me strong." Jonas pulled her down to him, and they kissed with all the pent-up feeling of the past months. Desire, yes, but more than that. Recognition, partnership, the bone-deep knowledge that they belonged together. Not because anyone had forced them, but because they'd chosen each other through everything. "Stay here," Evelyn whispered against his lips. "Don't make me go back to that bed alone." "Are you sure?" "I'm your wife." "In every way, Jonas. I want to be." They made love as the dawn broke, gentle and fierce by turns, claiming each other with a tenderness born of real affection. Afterward, wrapped together in blankets by the dying fire, Jonas held her and felt something heal in his chest. The frozen place where his father's stopped watch had kept him locked in grief. It was thawing, warming, coming back to life because this woman had fought her way past all his defenses and taught him to trust again. "We need to act quickly," Evelyn said, her head on his shoulder. "Caney gave my father until sundown today." "That's not much time. Then we start now." Jonas kissed her forehead. "First we ride to old Thomas. Get him to gather the mountain families. They deserve to know what happened to their land rights, and they deserve a chance to help make it right. Then to town, to Marshal Williams, and then we face Caney." Jonas tightened his arms around her. "Together. Together." She smiled, and it transformed her face. "I like that word more every time you say it." They rose and prepared, moving with the efficiency of partners who knew each other's rhythms. Jonas loaded his rifle and checked his revolver. Evelyn changed into her most practical clothes, ready for whatever came. Before they left, she touched the pressed wildflower in her mother's Bible. The gift Jonas had given her that first day. Things began to change. "For luck," she said, "we make our own luck." But Jonas smiled when he said it. They rode first to old Thomas's place, found him awake and mending fence. When they explained the situation, showed him the documents proving his family's water rights had been stolen, his weathered face went hard. "I always wondered how Nathaniel got that land so easy. We were struggling, couldn't afford lawyers. He swooped in with paperwork we didn't understand." Thomas looked at Jonas. "You're making this right?" "Trying to." "Need help, though. Caney's got hired guns. We need honest men who'll stand up to him. You'll have them. Give me 2 hours, I'll have 20 families here, all with grievances against Ashford or Caney or both." Thomas gripped Jonas's shoulder. "You're good people, both of you. I should have seen that from the start." The gathering that formed at old Thomas's property by midday was a cross-section of valley life. Mountain families who'd been pushed off good land, former ranch hands who'd been cheated on wages, merchants who'd been squeezed by Caney's business practices, small ranchers who'd lost water rights through fraud. Jonas and Evelyn stood before them, the documents spread out on Thomas's porch table, and told the truth, all of it. Nathaniel's crimes, Caney's extortion, the plan to fight back. "We can't promise you'll get everything back," Evelyn said, her voice carrying to the back of the crowd. "The damage is done, and some of it can't be undone. But we can promise restitution, fair compensation for what was stolen. And we can promise that Caney won't profit from any of this. Why should we trust you?" Someone called. "You're Ashford's daughter. You shouldn't trust me based on that." "Trust me based on this." Evelyn held up the documents. "I'm giving you evidence against my own father. I'm offering to dismantle everything he built to make things right. That's not loyalty to family. That's loyalty to justice," the crowd murmured, considering. Then old Thomas stepped forward. "I trust them. Jonas Hale is the most honest man I know, and his wife is proving herself cut from the same cloth. I'm with them." "Who else?" Hands rose throughout the crowd. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make a stand. Enough to face down Caney and his hired men with something more powerful than guns. The truth, backed by witnesses and righteous anger. "We ride to town," Jonas said. "We give these documents to Marshal Williams. And then we go to the Ashford ranch and we end this. Caney gets out of our valley or he faces consequences." The group mounted up, a ragged but determined force. Jonas and Evelyn rode at the front, side by side, and Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He was part of a community again, part of something larger than himself. And beside him was the woman who'd made that possible, who'd shown him that walls built to keep out hurt also kept out love. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that made all the difference. Nathaniel stood on the porch, watching his daughter face down the man who'd threatened everything. He'd been silent through the whole confrontation, and now, as the crowd quieted and turned their attention to him, Jonas saw something in the older man's face he'd never expected to see: shame. "Mr. Ashford," Marshal Williams said, walking back from securing Caney in his transport wagon, "we need to discuss your situation as well." "I know." Nathaniel's voice was steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I won't run from what I've done. I built this ranch on fraud and theft. These people deserve restitution, and I deserve whatever legal consequences come. The crowd stirred, surprised. They'd expected him to fight, to use his influence to escape responsibility. His honesty disarmed them. "Father," Evelyn said, climbing the porch steps to stand before him. "Why now? Why finally tell the truth?" "Because I'm tired, Evelyn. Tired of lying, tired of the weight of it all. And because watching you stand up to Caney with more courage than I've shown in 30 years made me ashamed." Nathaniel looked at the gathered crowd. "Your daughter became everything I failed to be. She chose justice over comfort, honesty over reputation. She's a better person than I ever was." "You can still make some of it right," Jonas said, joining them on the porch. "The ranch can be sold, proceeds divided among those you defrauded. It won't erase what was done, but it's a start, more than a start." Nathaniel pulled papers from his coat. "I've already signed the ranch over to Evelyn. All of it. She can decide what happens with it. She can make the choices I should have made years ago." Evelyn took the papers with shaking hands. "You're giving me the ranch? What's left of it after restitution, yes. You and Jonas build something better than I did. Something honest." Nathaniel looked at Jonas directly for the first time since the wedding. "I forced you into a marriage you didn't want. I did it to save my reputation, not caring what it cost either of you. I can't undo that. But I can say I was wrong. You're a good man, Jonas Hale, better than I ever gave you credit for. And you've made my daughter happy in a way I never could." Jonas didn't know what to say to that. He'd hated this man for months, blamed him for destroying his peace. But standing here now, seeing Nathaniel finally take responsibility, he found the anger had cooled to something more like pity. "What will you do?" Evelyn asked her father quietly. "After everything is settled, face whatever legal consequences come. Probably prison time for the fraud. I'll accept it. Maybe use whatever years I have left to become someone your mother could have been proud of." Nathaniel's eyes were wet. "I loved her so much, Evelyn. When she died, I lost my way completely. That's no excuse, but it's the truth. I thought if I built something massive enough, if I accumulated enough wealth and power, the pain would stop. It never did. It just grew until I couldn't see past it anymore." "I understand that," Jonas said, surprising himself. "After my parents died, I ran to the mountains for the same reason, to escape the hurt. The difference is, I hurt no one but myself, and I hurt everyone." Nathaniel nodded. "I'm sorry, Jonas, for forcing the marriage, for threatening you, for all of it." "I should be angry," Jonas said slowly. "But if you hadn't forced us together, I never would have found her, never would have learned that I could love someone again, that I could be part of something bigger than my own pain. So maybe, in the worst way possible, you did us both a favor." Evelyn slipped her hand into Jonas's. "We'll manage the ranch. Do right by the people you wronged. But not for you, Father. For them. Because they deserve justice. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just the chance to die, having finally done one right thing." Marshal Williams stepped forward. "Mr. Ashford, I'll need you to come with me. There are formal charges to file, statements to take. Given your cooperation, I'll speak to the judge about leniency, but I can't promise anything. I don't want promises. I want what's fair." Nathaniel looked at Evelyn one more time. "Be happy, daughter. Build a life with Jonas that's full of the love and honesty I failed to give you. That's all I want for you now." He walked down the steps, and the crowd parted to let him through. As he passed old Thomas, the older man spoke. "Nathaniel Ashford, you stole my family's water rights 30 years ago. Cost us our home. I should hate you. You have every right to. I do. But I'm old enough to know that hate just poisons you. So instead, I'll take what restitution you offer, and I'll forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Thomas nodded to him. "Use your time in prison well. Come out better than you went in." Others echoed the sentiment. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but acknowledgement. Acceptance that some justice would be done, and that they could move forward. The valley had been fractured for so long by Nathaniel's manipulations. Now it could begin to heal. As Williams took Nathaniel away, the crowd began to disperse. Families making plans, discussing next steps, forming the connections that would rebuild their community. Jonas and Evelyn stood on the porch of the ranch that was now theirs, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. "It's too much," Evelyn said quietly. "Managing all this, making restitution, running a ranch, we'll do it together. And we'll do it right," Jonas pulled her close. "First thing, we hire back the ranch hands at fair wages. Second, we work with old Thomas and the others to divide up the land fairly. Third, we build a life here that honors what the valley could be, not what your father made it. And fourth," Evelyn looked up at him, "fourth, we go home to our cabin sometimes. Just the two of us, in the mountains where this all started. Because I still need that peace, and I think you do too." "Our cabin," Evelyn smiled. "I like how that sounds. I never thought I'd call that rough place home, but it is. More than this grand house ever was," Jonas kissed her forehead. "Because home isn't a place. It's the person you're with." They stood together as darkness fell, two people who'd been forced together by cruelty and had chosen to stay together through love. Behind them, the ranch house stood empty and silent. Ahead of them, a future they'd build together, honest and hard and worth every struggle. The valley would heal. Justice would be done, as much as it could be. And Jonas and Evelyn Hale would face whatever came next, the way they'd faced everything since that forced wedding. Side by side, partners in every sense, proving that sometimes the worst beginnings lead to the best endings. Spring came to Silver Creek with a gentleness that felt like blessing. Jonas stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Evelyn tend the small garden she'd planted, where his mother's letters said her own mother had once grown flowers. Columbine and lupine, wild roses and mountain lilies. Evelyn's hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her hands dirty with soil, her face peaceful in a way he'd never seen in those first angry months. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Caney. 6 months of hard work, difficult decisions, and slow healing for the valley. True to their word, Jonas and Evelyn had divided the Ashford holdings fairly. Old Thomas's family got their water rights back, plus compensation for 30 years of loss. The Hendersons received title to land that should have been theirs all along. Dozens of other families received restitution that wouldn't erase the past, but acknowledged the wrong done to them. What remained of the ranch was smaller, more manageable, run with fair wages and honest dealings. The ranch hands who'd chosen to stay were loyal not out of fear, but out of respect. The valley was learning to trust the Hale name, though it would take years to fully overcome Nathaniel's legacy. Nathaniel himself was serving 5 years in territorial prison for fraud. He'd accepted the sentence without complaint, and his letters to Evelyn showed a man genuinely trying to change. She wrote back, cautiously rebuilding a relationship with her father, though it would never be what it might have been if he'd chosen differently from the start. Victor Kane faced 20 years for his crimes. The judges he'd bribed had been removed from their positions, replaced with honest men who couldn't be bought. The valley was slowly becoming a place where justice meant something again. But the changes that mattered most to Jonas weren't about land or money or legal victories. They were about the woman in his garden, the life they'd built together, the home they'd created from a forced beginning. Evelyn looked up and caught him watching. She smiled, that bright, genuine expression that still made his heart skip. "Are you going to stand there all morning, or are you going to help me plant these tomatoes?" "I'm admiring my wife's gardening skills." He walked over and knelt beside her. "And thinking about how far we've come. From enemies to partners to lovers." She handed him a seedling. "It's been quite a journey. Do you ever regret it? Being forced to marry me, to give up your old life?" Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she always did. "I regret how it happened. I regret that your choice was taken away, and mine. But I don't regret where we ended up. That old life was a cage made of silken lies. This life is hard, but it's real. And it's mine, ours." Jonas planted the tomato seedling carefully, the way she'd taught him. She'd brought order and beauty to his rough cabin, while he'd taught her the skills to survive the mountain. They'd shaped each other, made each other better. "There's something I need to tell you," Evelyn said, setting down her trowel. Her voice carried a nervousness that made Jonas look at her sharply. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think so. I hope not. She took his dirt-covered hand in hers. Jonas, I'm pregnant. The world seemed to stop. Jonas stared at her, processing the words, and then joy flooded through him so intensely he couldn't speak. A child, their child. Life continuing, growing, proof that something beautiful could come from their forced beginning. Say something, Evelyn whispered, searching his face. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, as if she might break. I'm terrified, he admitted, and happier than I've ever been. How is that possible? I don't know. But I feel the same way. She pulled back to look at him. Are we ready for this? We weren't ready for marriage either. We figured it out. Jonas placed his hand gently on her stomach, where no sign of the baby showed yet. We'll figure this out too. Together. Together. Evelyn leaned her forehead against his. I'm going to need so much help. I don't know anything about babies. Neither do I. But old Thomas's daughter just had her third. She'll teach us. And we'll make mistakes and learn and do the best we can. Jonas kissed her softly. That's all anyone can do. They sat in the garden holding each other, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. Jonas thought about his father's stopped pocket watch, about time frozen by grief. Last week he'd finally wound it again. Let it tick forward. Let time move the way it was supposed to, carrying him into a future he no longer feared. We should tell people, Evelyn said eventually. Your face is going to give it away anyway. You look like you might burst. I feel like it, Jonas laughed, the sound surprising him with its lightness. A father? Me? A man who swore he'd never let anyone close enough to hurt him. And now you're going to have a tiny person who will have complete power to break your heart. Evelyn smiled. Funny how love works. Terrifying is what it is. And wonderful. Can it be both? I think the best things always are. They worked in the garden until noon, talking about names and futures and fears. When they finally went inside to wash up, Jonas looked at the cabin with new eyes. Soon it would hold 3 people instead of 2. Soon there would be a child's laughter echoing off these walls he'd built for solitude. The wooden box that held his mother's letters sat on the shelf, no longer hidden under the bed. Beside it now was Evelyn's mother's Bible with the pressed wildflower. 2 histories, 2 losses, 2 people who'd found each other in the worst way possible and chosen to make it the best thing that ever happened to them. Later that day, they rode to town to share the news. The church where they'd been forced to marry stood on the main street, white paint gleaming in the spring sunshine. On impulse, Jonas stopped there. What are we doing? Evelyn asked. Something I should have done months ago. He helped her down and led her inside. The church was empty except for Pastor Miller, who looked up in surprise from his Bible. Jonas, Evelyn, this is unexpected. Pastor, I'd like to renew our vows, Jonas said. The first time we were forced. This time I want to choose. In front of God and anyone who wants to witness it, I want to choose Evelyn as my wife. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Jonas, you deserve to be chosen, he said firmly. You deserve a wedding where we both say yes, because we mean it, not because we have to. Will you marry me again, Evelyn? For real this time? Yes, she laughed through her tears. Yes, 1,000 times, yes, Pastor Miller smiled. I think that can be arranged. How about Sunday? Give people time to gather? They spent the next 3 days spreading the word, and on Sunday the church was packed. Old Thomas was there with his family. The ranch hands came in their best clothes. Merchants and mountain families, former enemies united by witnessing something good finally happening in Silver Creek. Evelyn wore a simple blue dress, not white this time. Jonas wore his best shirt, the one she'd sewn for him. They stood at the altar where they'd stood 6 months ago, but everything was different. They were smiling. Their hands joined willingly. Their eyes held only love. Do you, Jonas Hale, take Evelyn Ashford Hale to be your wife? Pastor Miller asked. I do. I choose her freely and completely. And do you, Evelyn Ashford Hale, take Jonas Hale to be your husband? I do. I choose him today and always. The simple gold rings they already wore were blessed and replaced with intention and joy. When Pastor Miller pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a community that had learned what Jonas and Evelyn already knew, that sometimes the hardest beginnings lead to the strongest foundations. That forced proximity could become chosen partnership. That love, real love, was worth every struggle it took to find it. They left the church hand in hand, and old Thomas threw rice like it was a real wedding, which it was. The first one had been a legal requirement. This one was a celebration of choice, of commitment, of two people who'd been trapped and had built freedom together. That night, back in their cabin in the mountains, they sat by the fire as they had so many times before. But now Evelyn's head rested on Jonas's shoulder, his hand on her stomach where their child grew, and the peace between them was complete. "Thank you," Jonas said quietly. "For what?" "For being stubborn enough to survive that first awful day. For teaching me that walls don't keep you safe, they just keep you alone. For loving me even when I didn't deserve it. You always deserved it. You just didn't believe it yet." Evelyn tilted her face up to kiss him. "We saved each other, Jonas. That's what we do." Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wildflowers and possibility. Inside, two people who'd been forced together by pride and cruelty had built something neither could have imagined standing at that altar 6 months ago. A marriage of equals. A partnership of choice, a love that had been tested and proven, and would endure whatever came next. Sometimes, Jonas thought as Evelyn fell asleep in his arms, the worst thing that happens to you opens the door to the best thing you never knew you needed. His forced marriage had become his chosen future. His greatest resentment had become his deepest joy. And in the morning, they'd wake up together and face another day building the life they'd learned to create. Honest, difficult, beautiful, and entirely their own.